very much about relationship. Um, so I want to talk about environment as relationship. How are we moving forward in terms of CLC? The last time I was really with you as a group was when we were in Lebanon, and I think that was 2013. And we were talking then about redirecting the carbon and poverty footprints of our generation. So even if you look at how we talked in 2013, we were talking about the social and the ecological as one. I think it is very much deepened since then. So let us pause for a while. We'll just put that out of the way and find our place, find our time, and find our context. We're all strung around the world. So this is really a universal meeting in the sense that if we go and look outside, we'll either see the stars or the one star that keeps us burning. We see all life before us. So it's a lovely gathering of traditions around the world. So if we understand environmental spirituality, it is where the natural environment is experienced as a spiritual source, motivating our commitments and fostering our celebration of life. So as we gather from the morning of, where is it, Quito you are, right across the world to Melbourne, let us for a moment just pause and be thankful for our day and for our night. We give you thanks, O Lord, for knowing you amongst all life, amongst all of our relationships. It is in relationship that we find you, that we know your loving mercy. And so it is from there we begin with hearts of hope, with hearts of love. And we seek, especially in this gathering, to give praise to you and to express in earnest our care for neighbor and for creation. So, as we feel, as it were, at home in terms of where we are, even though I'm very far away from home, I am at peace, I am at rest here, I'm amongst very kind people. Let us turn our gaze and look at the world for the moment and understand some of the realities that we face. So I'm going to go through 4 steps. Now, if anybody wants to ask a question, a clarification, give a comment as I go along, please do so. Yeah. So I want to start with the challenges of this generation. The challenges were recently laid out by a global agenda survey. Actually, they were done in 2014. And they said the challenges that we were facing in 2015, these in front of you. And they can be summarized. They can be summarized on three levels. The first is very clearly the political. We're having increasingly unclear geopolitical shifts. We're having national elections. We're having major shifts in global trade. So on one level, there's a fair amount of uncertainty. On the next level, if we look at it, a number of the points there really are about youth, unemployment, education, development of skills. So that's a second level. A third level or major area of concern globally in terms of what is challenging us are the inequalities and the environmental condition of the world, whether it's an urban situation that needs to be managed better, whether it's urban-rural tensions, whether it's the adaptation to climate change. So these three levels of broadly the political, the generation of the coming youth, and the inequalities in the environment is one way of summing it. Another way that it has been put for last year are global trends and global risks. Again, it becomes a question of the inequalities that are there, the polarization and public disaffection for the political processes, affecting the decisions, the decision-making globally, and the collaboration. Like with the UN, many of the processes of the UN are weakening. Many of the global social processes, too, are being heavily tested. And what's happening is we keep talking of risks and managing risks, but in managing risks, we're not always looking at the real factors and the reality. We're looking at the mass response. So I think a number of countries, including my own country where I am in the Philippines, have had some very difficult election outcomes, and very unclear socioeconomic trajectory. So, okay, these are the things that are very disquieting and obviously are much larger than us that we're challenged with. We're also faced in a discussion for the last what would this be, about 3 to 5 years, what's called the planetary boundaries. We very quickly talk of climate change, but we all know of the loss of biodiversity and the loss of ecosystems. We know land use change is reaching critical levels. We're unclear about fresh water use. It's certainly a major problem in Africa and becoming a major problem in many other parts of the world as well. Biochemical flows seem to be somewhat out of control, particularly if we look at what's happening with the phosphorus-nitrogen dynamic, ocean acidification. All of these novel entities involve about 10,000 chemicals that we're not really sure what their impact is. Glyphosate is the most recent concern, but this also includes nuclear to nanoplastics. So the one we were able to manage was the ozone depletion, if you like, but that has had its consequences. And in the center of all of these planetary boundaries, we've got human need, and how can human need be addressed at the same time? It's often put in terms of jobs, and that if we curtail certain activities, then jobs will suffer. But we know this to be very much a political dynamic at times. At the moment, a great concern is, for example, with the coal trade around the world. I'm here in Australia, so there are many questions being asked here about the Australian and the Indonesian dynamic of export and China's own consumption. So major block of the coal question, as it were, is Australia, Indonesia, China, and many other countries are involved there as well, including the consumption by Japan. These questions are bigger than what we can deal with. Even in the Asia-Pacific region, Jesuit discussions and people last year brought together a whole series of concerns which we're trying to process and write up. Everybody has got their own, shall I say, list to work with. So if we take this back to where Progressio 72 is, we are experiencing the consequences of a style of living and a so-called progress that seems to be very hard to challenge in the present global dynamic. The system isn't working. That's easy to say. The difficulty is to understand how to challenge it. So what the Holy Father was talking to us about, talking particularly to social political movements in Bolivia when he was there, was let us say no to an economy of exclusion, inequality, where money rules in place of service. This is an economy that kills. This is an economy that excludes and destroys Mother Earth. And this is what you have echoed in 72. And the challenge is, how do we make this real, this saying no? Because we have to say something positive. We have to give hopeful opportunity. I was surprised 2-3 months ago when I was asked to write a review of Laudato Si from technology technocracy perspective. There must be about 80 references in the document to it. Though I've read it, I think 7 times at this stage, I'd never read it from that specific word search approach, if you like. So I was really surprised at the quality of the critique and its consistency throughout the document, and the vision that it gives us, a new and universal solidarity, where only in relating to each other and to creation will we establish the proper use of technology. I call this Technocracy 101. There's a challenge in terms of rapidification, which actually the first diagrams are illustrating. And we've got to be able to understand where we're focused on the common good and sustainable human development, and where we are focused on objectives isolated from the reality of human need. So that's the challenge I feel that's in the document. And the goal is actually put very well and very simply, very painfully. It is for us to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus discover what each of us can do about it and how we do it together. The world is trying to get by today. We know this. To embrace it as our suffering sounds to most people a failure. And that's what we really have to be able to go beyond. And we can only do this if we have hope. And many of the centers of hope, rather than optimism or idealism, come from contexts of faith. So it is our faith that gives us the space to envision and to be able to share a hope. So yes, we've gone through some of the challenges that we face, and as we did at the beginning, we need to be able to reflect, to start with gratitude, to share in a hope. If we can't, then we're really not going to be able to make the right decisions, and we're not going to have the adequate strength and attitude to make them. We need a sensitivity, we need a vision. So we're asking ourselves, okay, how do we develop this sensitivity? How do we work with others? A lot of it starts on a personal level, trying to simplify our own lives, trying to eliminate what's not necessary. And as the bottom line says, they're accepting our own imperfections. Sometimes we're too ideal. So, if we're able to start with this simplicity, it's complex in a way because a simple lifestyle is different for everybody. Yeah? But what's common in it is that I learn what enough is. I know, okay, this is enough for today. This is enough for us to live by. I know my impact on the planet. I'm concerned about it. I work for health and happiness. I am free and I am mortal. These are important things. Otherwise, people walk as if they are invincible. I consciously consider life of the next generation. And what I stress most of all with the youth is the importance of feeling that I belong. If the youth do not have a sense of belonging, then it's terribly destabilizing as difficulties arise. So I know my peace, I feel I belong. Yes, I'm challenged at times, and I accept that simplicity is a process. It's not a goal to be achieved next week. So, I often put it in terms of enoughness. What is enough for me? What are my priorities? What are my commitments? I think that helps us really start down a road that we can manage. Okay. So, Francis, the Holy Father re-echoes this. He says we cannot consider ourselves fully loving if we disregard any aspect of reality. Peace, justice, and the preservation of creation are absolutely interconnected. And he's really communicated this in the document. If we put them into silos, then we're back to a reductionist approach. We have to recognize that we are all connected. Okay. So, coming from that, there's a very clear call for reconciliatory action. Okay, and this is what we're moving to in many activities, but it starts from where I am. I go beyond self-improvement. Sometimes people get stuck or isolate themselves in self-improvement because that's their way of coping or locking out the world around. We need to engage and work with others. That's something that's very difficult to do with consistency. Very quickly, people at times drop out of things. So to hang in there is very important, not only for the issue and the agenda, but for the other people who are there. Understanding Earth's boundaries, as we said, the planetary boundaries, and the human needs. Sustainable Development Goals are a good description of them. Don't get frozen in the now. This is, again, I think, something that's very important in terms of the youth. Many of the young people really get caught and live for the present. The past history doesn't mean anything to them, and the future is uncertain. So people stay where they are. We need to learn from the past. We need to look to the future with its uncertainties. And it's in this way we make personal commitments. We make community commitments. We belong to a community. And then we can take on a global engagement. So again, if we look at Laudato Si, we see an integral ecology, we see an acknowledgement, an enthusiasm of the science, clear ethics, spirituality, and an action. So that's something of the flow in terms of what's at the heart of being human. We do have to move to an action. Now, if I take for a moment scientifically the planetary boundaries that I showed you earlier on, these were things that were presented to the IPCC a number of years ago. And if I take them out of that raised diagram and put them on the landscape that I'm familiar, you can put it on your landscape, it actually becomes very clear that there are three drivers of change. Somewhere down here, there's a pen that I can use. Okay, I have a red pen, I think. So obviously, there are the fossil fuels, and that leads up to climate change. And in that way, climate change connects to many other things, but this is one of the biggest movements, the fossil fuels. The second one really is land use system change. That goes from the palm oil to the soybean to the beef to the many of the problems associated with that. If you like, all of the arrows are coming out of these two in particular and novel entities. This also, relates to the fertilizers, the chemistry, everything else. These are three. You could say also water, the way it's managed at times. But this is where a lot of the instability and lack of security for people, particularly at the margins, comes from. And the problems we have with keeping a balanced environment. The Holy Father talks of ecological citizenship. And at times, the education that's there really fails to instill good habits. We really need to shift from a checklist of things to do to an attitude by which it's not just one more thing we have to do, but there's an appreciation and an inclination to do it without thinking of it. The Holy Father talks of the existence of laws and the importance of laws. But laws are only effective if society is adequately motivated to accept them. And this, he says, is only achieved through cultivating sound virtues. So, again, it comes back to really what sustains community and how community moves out into society. And this is what he is asking us to develop. We'll come back to that again. Really, the third aspect I wanted to go to are really communities of practice. You are a community in CLC that's extremely unique, widespread, and of tremendous value. We need to look outward. We need to build those relationships outward and allow people question, as it were, our spirituality, the why of what we do. But we have to be doing something. So we need the basic context of a community to dare to envision the world beyond. This is also a great difficulty for young people today if they don't belong to a community. Either they're totally idealistic or brash or unrealistic, and often, they wear out if they are operating alone. And it's very hard in this virtual world, in an urbanized world, in a very segmented world, to actually sustain community. We need to do this by promoting values, by seeking greater sustainability in all of our practices, inviting others to share, listening more deeply and responding, addressing the social vulnerabilities and insecurity, and seeking peace in so many ways. Healing the landscape. Much of this is really a practice of healing. The Holy Father talks about self-improvement. By itself will not remedy the extreme complex situations that we're facing. Isolated individuals can lose their ability and their freedom, and this is very evident in today's world. Social problems must be addressed by community, not simply by the sum of individuals seeking to do good. Ecological conversion, he says, is needed to bring about the lasting change. It is a community conversion. We realize in anything we're doing, we can't achieve much if we're acting alone. Again, in this, what's at the core of it is always the common good. In the present condition of a global society, where injustices abound and growing numbers of people are deprived of basic human rights and considered expendable, the principle of the common good immediately becomes clear. And this is at the core of our actions, whether we see it as ecological or primarily social. They're integrated. So I hear in many contexts where we talk of communities of practice, communities of intent. In Australia, there's quite a discussion about communities of justice. So we're called to connect our lifestyle and community with our environment and planet. And usually there's a dynamic, there's a context, there's a physical time and place where values are shared and they're picked up. And there's a practice activity that goes on amongst a common number of people. Where this often comes out is, say, in organic farming, where people come, they have allotments or different arrangements, like in Guelph in Canada, like what I saw with cities here in Melbourne this afternoon, where people come and work the land, share, sell their produce, but in the process, there's great value exchange. Or in the bicycle repair corner, community activities. So if we're looking at a technology in step with humanity, okay, first we can acknowledge the benefits and also the misuse of technology. The misuse of technology is often aligned with, shall I say, the market forces behind it. And this is where we've got to gain an awareness of how the human person is configured by technology. This is how people use cell phones and what you call them, pads, iPads, and all sorts of other different things. Their immediate reality is different often to their context around them. And really what the Holy Father was getting at, technocracy as distinct from democracy, if you like, is where the economic and the financial systems combine with the political dynamics to actually drive a consumerist society, to drive dependencies, both financial and technological, to the point that the values of community are lost. So we're challenged to see creativity, a local to global dynamic. We keep coming back to try to affirm the common good, and through the coming generation establish a broader social and economic process for more just and sustainable use. And this is really what's facing the next generation. How to manage the technology in their life so that the technology doesn't lead them. So for me, with a lot of the youth that I work with, it really is in establishing the capacity for interiority, for interior reflection. In many cases, I see when I'm working with a larger group, I will often use the examine in the evening just to go deeper beyond all of what's happening, to explore a little attitudes and habits. Then the values become clear. So this is where, again, the Holy Father is talking about intergenerational solidarity. It really isn't an option. It's a question of justice. And therefore, certainly my generation has to relate, has a deep responsibility to try to help a younger generation understand many of the things that have gone wrong, but as much as that, to also help them establish, create the occasions of hope and the vision that's needed. For a lot of the youth where I am, we're trying to understand the economic marginalization that we're suffering with, how to be inclusive of others, and look at the life support systems that are there and see how we can build that. So how does this reconciliation then, in the final run, lead to action? I think if we take a landscape, if we take a watershed, it's often the easiest way to put our life and love of creation together. We appreciate the solar energy, where the water comes from, how we keep that balance with the soil, with the vegetation. There's a lot more effort at rebuilding with indigenous plants, with indigenous practices, with agroforestry. Particularly these farms and allotments where people work. The local markets are most important. Buying locally, understanding where it's coming from, and beginning to try to influence some of the more deeply urban contexts. This is a great challenge. Biggest urban problem in one sense in many areas, with problems of air quality in many areas, but also of waste and waste segregation, and really trying to get a better cycle to live and greater context for communities to come together. Particularly those at the margins, they often don't have the space and literally the environment that's conducive to community sharing concerns and opportunities. Another area is in education. Much of education is in silos. So we're greatly challenged to teach a more integral science and economy, social need. So one of the projects that I've been involved in is this Healing Earth textbook, which is online, primarily for final year of high school, first year of college. So really trying to put many of the questions together. a number of you are deeply involved in regional church networks. There's REBAC and REPAM has been going the longest there. I'm meeting with some of the Asian bishops next month to try to talk about a network for Asia's forest. It's much more fragmented. Well, it's intense around areas of the Mekong River, for example, but socio-politically that's very hard to engage. There's also the Pacific. It's not a forest, it's an ocean, but it's deeply impacted most of all by climate. Yeah, and the temperature rises in the Pacific and the impacts on people's lives. Science and society is really asking for a communication for active collaboration. If we look at what's happened in Australia with the loss of many of the scientists at the Central Science Bureau last year over the Great Barrier Reef, okay, many of them have been reinstated. The Adani mines and the relationships with the bank in Australia is also a major question of science and society. All of these things are not relative, but it's very hard to deal with that in present social media society. Another thing that I've been trying to work with are flights for forest, a basic contribution for each flight so that we can do some regenerative natural forest in, at this stage, Cambodia, Timor-Leste, the Philippines, but I hope we can expand this scheme. I'm talking with people in North America as whether we could do this for the Amazonia. There's a lot of interest in Europe as well. So these are schemes of which there are many others that we're connecting. I'm also trying to see if the universities will get together. The United States has been the most progressive in this. We're seeing a knock-on effect in the institutes of distinction that are there, but we've recently had meetings in Calcutta, Sanata Dharma. We're looking at one in Australia, possibly next year. So how do we move for that change? I think one of the things, I'm nearly at the end there, sorry. I think one of the things that is pretty valuable are the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm well aware that the Millennium Development Goals were pretty much a failure as far as I'm concerned. Partly because they were focused on a few countries and they weren't bottom up. I think really with the Sustainable Development Goals, they're for every country because it's recognized there are marginalized people in every country. They put them together in terms of prosperity, people's dignity, the planet, and unilateral basis at the bottom. I'm finding that it's very helpful to get people or organizations to check what goals are most important to link, to measure, to prod them. The other thing is in recent discussions, even with the World Bank and that, there's this question of if these projects or these programs are going to be successful, we have to ensure that the communities on the ground are involved, and they have to be involved with hope. If the communities are not involved with hope, none of these programs, none of these goals are actually going to work. So we're realizing a lot more work has to be done, at least the organizations are, with actually spending time with communities' own attitudes and perspectives. This was a local dynamic of trying to go from the local to the global, how we could use Sustainable Development Goals, and then how we could use them in relation to local government to sort of negotiate a way forward. This was another discussion. If you look at the center of this, it's economic and social inclusion. So these are the social needs, and then the environmental needs, and then to the right-hand side, there are many of the different responses. This is something we were trying to do in a particular area in the Philippines, but we've also done this for Vietnam and several other areas. It's a way of road mapping. It's a way of doing some strategic planning. Yes, I've been spending some time while in Australia just looking at the coal and how complex the whole situation is, and how money is really developing a carbon bomb as they produce it. We're going to end up with this coal in the Philippines if this goes through. So we're concerned about this. To wrap up a little, as at the beginning, we may see an environmental crisis where there's growing uncertainty, where there's growing uncontrollability, and we may be focused on the crisis. The effort is really to accept the uncertainties that are there and to shift to scenario planning. In many cases, we're moving to hedging, or adaptive management. But we've got to make a scenario, a series of options, that are possibly attainable and be able to respond to the situation. So it's really to build the resilience, the socio-economic, environmental capacities at the local level. This is what's extremely important. So, I don't know, questions I might ask to you. What are the three core sustainable development goals that's at the center of what you're doing? If you take into consideration your profession, how do you want to live that out? Given this broader understanding of environmental justice that we're talking about, that's socially inclusive, how does this contribute to our practices? Our practices as in human spirit. Okay, this could apply to CLC, but it could also apply to the organization you work for during the week. How do we look after the people in the organization? The practice framework is what really is the work, and how can we include an ecology into that? And our business processes. Again, where is our care for creation in our business processes? Maybe it's segregation, maybe it's purchasing, etc. What actions can we relate to in our own countries? In terms of responding to planetary boundaries, social needs. We're doing, I feel, an awful lot, but we're not able to connect it. The more we're able to connect the work we do, the greater value we'll be able to see in it. One of the challenges that I'm facing is how can I get young people to discuss and engage with planetary boundaries and their own future? This is a major challenge that we're facing. So, okay, we've got advocacy of processes, we've increasing eco-literacy and comprehension of justice issues, how we might want to go about those. So, I've tried to go through with you a level of starting with relationship, that everything is really a life of relationship, and out of that relationship with gratitude, we should also be able to generate hope and the ability to embrace much of the suffering. Also, a reconciliation where we actively listen there's no point in bawling out someone who doesn't understand or agree with or doesn't want to accept that there's climate change. We've got to listen, acknowledge, and then try to take up from the bottom what possibly might else be considered. Advocacy is global, and we really have to learn how to collaborate both locally and how this connects globally. And if we have the experience locally, then we're much more attuned to the global dynamics. And third, I would say regeneration. How do we restore, regenerate realities? I put this from a Jesuit context, but it's any faith context. In a faith context, we're really dealing with the internal and the external struggle of life. Yeah? How, in my heart, can I live out what I understand the meaning, the relationship of life to be? So, in one sense, I say good energy, is our business. Amen. So, I'd again like to thank you. I have an early morning tomorrow, so I will, Mauricio, come back to you along the way and get updates what it is. I'm very humbled to be able to talk with you this evening, and I really feel that this is a blessed occasion, and the Lord will bless your actions, will bless your reflections, your discernments, and your actions. So thank you.